Welcome to Landscape Photo Editing Sessions. I'm Rayata Arcuri. In this episode, I'm going to be doing some advanced luminosity mask adjustments. Alright, so let's get started. I have this photo of a sunset and it has a lot of dynamic range. So this is the base exposure, this is -3 and +3. So that's like six stops of range, and I'm going to be using luminosity mask to blend them, and also some other advanced adjustments to make it easier to blend. So I'm going to start off by editing the base exposure, and I'm just going to remove the distortion and vignette, and also remove chromatic aberration, and I'm going to go in 100% and make sure the chromatic aberration gets removed. Alright, so that's all I'm going to do with I'm not going to play with any of the settings, I'm just going to synchronize them now. And also I'm going to add +2 to the underexposed layer or image, and -2 to the overexposed one. So I found that if you try to blend the images with that much range, it won't look good. But so one stop of range each is a pretty good amount to blend with. And then later on I'm gonna also add in some more range of light. So I'm going to open the images now in Photoshop. And I'm going to load them into a stack. I'm going to adjust them in order from the underexposed layer, the base exposure, and then the overexposed layer. Alright, the next thing I'm going to do is create a luminosity template. So to do that, I'm going to add in the base exposure image and increase the highlights all the way, decrease the shadows, increase the whites all the way and decrease the blacks all the way, and then increase the contrast all the way. So what I'm trying to do is create a better selection for the luminosity mask to make. So I'm trying to separate the sky from the foreground. So you see, notice how I increased the contrast, those clouds kind of disappeared a little bit. So this is like the best possible selection I can do right now. By increasing the highlights all the way, it's blowing out the sky and separating the foreground by reducing the blacks. So I'm gonna add that in and just call it a luminosity template. Okay, I'm gonna generate a luminosity mask and then hide the layer. I'm also gonna create blank layer masks on these two layers, and then go to my channels and select the brights 1. So right now I'm blending, or I'm taking away the foreground on the base exposure, so the sky will be exposed. I'm going to hide the selection by pressing Ctrl H, and then using a large white brush I'm going to paint the sky back in. Okay, I'm going to press Alt and click on the layer mask to check out the layer mask, and then paint in the sky one more time to get rid of those clouds. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is fix that the sun star, kind of see how it kind of got blown out with the luminosity template that we made. So this time I'm gonna create a luminosity mask based on the layer that we have here. So I'm gonna generate some luminosity mask and then go into the channels and select the brights one. Okay, that's why I was still seeing that. I scroll all the way down and then here it is. I'm gonna select brights one and then go to my mask, hide it, go to my layer mask, and then use a white brush to paint the sun star back in. So I'm just gonna create a smooth transition. And then I'm gonna use a black brush and then just Control D to deselect the selection, and then just go back and take away some of the light or those other parts. Okay, I'm actually going to remove some of the outside just to try to blend it in a little bit better. Alright, that's looking good. Okay, the next thing, I'm gonna bring out some more detail out of the sky. So these blown out parts, I'm gonna use this layer and go to my channels and select maybe brights 5. Then go to my mask and paint it in with a large brush. Okay, it's looking good. And finally, to get more detail out of the sky, I'm gonna bring in the underexposed layer again, and this time I'm just gonna do +1 exposure. So this will allow me to get more detail from the sun. And then make sure that's lined, rasterize that, and then add a blank layer mask. Go to my channels, select bright 6, or actually I'm just gonna create new luminosity mask based on this image. So I'm gonna disable that layer mask by pressing pressing shift click, and then I'm gonna delete the luminosity mask just to create space for a new one, and then generate that. Then go to my channels and then I'm gonna do brights 4, hide that with Control H, the selection, and then paint it in with a brush. Alright, so that added just a little bit more detail, and we're gonna go back in and make some adjustments to bring out more contrast and detail within the sky. So I'm just gonna check out my layers and see if there's anything else I want to adjust. Okay, that looks good. Now I'm going to start editing the sky. So the first thing I want to do is bring out more contrast and reduce the overall brightness of the sky. So to do that, I'm going to create another luminosity template, but this time I'm going to create one for contrast. So I'm going to bring in the underexposed layer again, and this time it's going to be +2, and this time I'm going to increase the contrast all the way. So this will allow me to get a luminosity selection based on contrast, and that'll allow me to add more contrast when I do the curve adjustments. So I'm going to call this luminosity template 2. And then I'm going to create luminosity mask based on the template for contrast. Okay, now I can create a curve adjustment layer, and I'm just gonna pull down the curve until I kind of want the contrast or the dark part of the clouds to be that level of exposure. And then I'm going to invert the mask by pressing Control-I, and then I'm going to go into the channels and then scroll down and find the dark channels, and then select darks 1, hide that mask or the selection, go into the curves and start painting on onto the clouds. So I'm going to check the layer mask and just keep painting on. So notice how it reduced the overall contrast, so anything that's white is going to be affected, and anything that's black won't be affected. So notice how I added in more contrast by making the luminosity template for contrast and selecting the dark part of the clouds, and then adding in a curves adjustment to only affect that part. So now those parts of the clouds are darker. Okay, next thing I'm gonna do is fix the outside or the foreground. I don't want the foreground to be within the curve, affected by the curve. So I'm gonna delete the mask or the luminosity mask, and then go back to the template 1 and generate that one. So this one's for separating the foreground from the sky. Now we can go back and find the one we just made, select it, Control Shift I to invert the selection, go back to the curves, and use a large black brush to paint out the foreground. Okay, that looks good, and I'm also going to paint out a little bit over here. So I deselected that selection already. Okay, I'm gonna go to bright 6 and I'm trying to get rid of the curves that are affecting the foreground. Oh, forgot to invert the selection. Okay, invert the selection, and then I can fix that. Okay, that's looking good. And I've noticed a little bit over here, it's a little bit too dark in these clouds over here, so I'm just gonna use a black brush and reduce the opacity maybe to 20%, and then even it out to kind of a neutral gray color. Alright, that looks good. And the one problem I have with my image is that when I took the image, I kind of left my hand on the tripod, my finger, because well, with the camera I had, I couldn't do the bracketed photos with the remote, so there's a little bit of camera shake, and that's why the images are unaligned. But if you used a tripod and a remote shutter, you shouldn't have a problem with that. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is add even more contrast. So I want to bring out more detail within the area and within the clouds. So I'm going to add another curves adjustment and reduce the curve until I like that amount. Control I to invert the mask, and then go to my channels and choose a mid-tones selection from the contrast template. Okay, I'm gonna choose mid-tones 2, select that, hide the selection with Control H, and then just paint in where I want the curve to be affected by. So I want those clouds to have a little bit more contrast, and also the clouds over here. And I'm just gonna have it affect all of it, and then I can go back and make some fine adjustments after. So I'm gonna press Control D, deselect that, and I'm gonna go back and select that because I don't want the foreground to be affected. So I'm gonna go to Bright 6 with the foreground and sky separation luminosity template, and then go back to my layer mask and use a Control Shift I, forgot to invert it, so I want to take away some of that, the foreground, and then maybe a little bit more. Okay, that's looking good. Okay, so I think the sky looks pretty good, and now I'm gonna focus on the foreground. So I want to increase the brightness a little bit in the foreground and also the contrast. So I'm just gonna create a curves adjustment and increase the brightness a little bit, and then increase the contrast. So I'm gonna bring up the highlights a lot, and I'm gonna reduce the midtone just a little bit. I'm gonna fix that curve. Let's see. Looks a little bit too bright, maybe. I'm gonna try to equalize that curve a little bit, straighten it out. Okay, I like that. And I'm also gonna paint out the mask right there. So I'm just gonna use a black brush and paint that out. I don't want that sun flare to be affected. Alright, the next thing I want to do is increase the brightness of the water a lot. So I'm gonna just use a curve adjustment and just bring up the brightness of that. So I kind of want to make a pathway leading towards the sun, so it's gonna guide the viewer's eye towards the subject. I'm gonna press Ctrl I to invert the mask and paint in only the areas I want. So I want to make sure I don't paint in any of those rocks. I don't want those to be brightened. So I'm going to zoom up all the way and make sure to get a good selection. Alright, that looks good, and now I want to increase the contrast of the water. So I just want to reduce the brightness of the dark areas and the bright areas, so it's not apparent right now, but I can go to a dark part like right there and then go to a bright part like right here, and then just reduce that a lot and also increase the highlights. And I'm also gonna change the blending mode to luminosity, because you notice that the blue color cast, I don't want the color to be affected. And then I'm going to press Ctrl I to invert it, and then use a brush and paint in the area I want to be an increase in contrast. I'm just gonna adjust that a little bit more. Okay. Okay, that's looking kind of bad. Let's see if I can try to fix that a little bit. So I think if I move the layers a little bit, that might fix it. Okay, that's a little bit better, but so just make sure you're using a tripod and make sure the camera doesn't move during the exposure, or else you have that problem. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is reduce the saturation of the sun flare a little bit. It kind of blows out, or the detail is kind of being reduced by the amount of color there is. So I'm going to go to a hue saturation or vibrance, and then just reduce the saturation until I like the color of the sun flare, lens flare. Control I to invert that, and then use a brush to paint in the areas I want reduction in saturation. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is sharpen the clouds. So I want to increase the contrast a little bit within the clouds, and also make them a little bit sharper. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to press Control Shift Alt and E to make a copy of all the visible layers. I'm also going to press Control J to duplicate it, and then I'm going to use the unsharpen mask, and then sharpen the clouds with a amount of 200% and radius of 3 pixels. So notice how the contrast in the clouds over here, it's more detailed now and a little bit more contrast. And press OK. And I'm also going to do noise reduction. So I'm just using a plugin called Noise Aware and using the night scene preset. So I'm gonna lose a little bit of detail from the sharpening, but that's okay. I mainly wanted to sharpen up that part, this part over here. And then I'm also gonna fix that nasty halo by using a mask and then a black brush, and I'm just gonna paint along the edge. Then I'm gonna go to the mask and do a selection with the polygonal lasso tool. So select all around the areas that I just painted on. Then I'm going to select the foreground and fill it with black by pressing Alt and Delete and having the foreground color on black. So Alt, Delete, and that'll fill it. Okay, that's looking, I don't know, still looking pretty bad, but you won't have that problem. Maybe if I refine the edge a little bit on one of the selections, that I might be able to get it a little bit better and not as like sharp. So I'm gonna try fixing that real fast, and then just using the shift edge and maybe increase the radius a little bit and just feather it a touch. I'm gonna see if that's any better. Okay, that kind of improved it, but now there's like a darker edge. Okay, well, never mind that. I'm gonna continue to edit the photo. Okay, the next thing I'm gonna do is retouch it a little bit. So before I retouch it, I'm gonna increase the curves by a lot so I can see what I'm doing. So I made a new layer for the adjustments, and I'm gonna use the clone stamping tool and start cloning out the parts I don't want. Alrighty, once I'm done, I'm gonna delete that curves, and finally I'm gonna crop it. Alright, so that's looking good. So, advanced luminosity adjustments. So by doing the regular curve, blending with luminosity mask, I have a 1 EV separation of the bracketed photos. And started off with the overexposed layer with a -2 EV. Added on the base exposure, and then added in more detail with the underexposed layer with +2 EV, so it's a 1 EV separation. Sorry if you don't understand that. And then I added in one more image just to add even more detail. And then using the luminosity mask template. So the first one was to separate the foreground and the sky to get a better selection for the luminosity mask. And then I used that luminosity mask selection to increase the contrast in the sky, and even more doing a mid-tone selection from that. And then I used a luminosity or scratch that, and then I increased the contrast of the foreground and also the brightness and also the water. And oh, one last thing, I forgot to sharpen that layer I made below that. So I'm just going to use the Smart Sharpened with a amount of 200 and a radius of 3. So that'll get everything nice and sharp. And if I reduce the image size, everything will be nice and sharp. I'm just going to do another Smart Sharpen, but the radius with 0.2. And now everything will be nice and sharp for uploading to the web. And obviously you won't have that terrible halo and weird thing happening here if you have the tripod and using a remote shutter. Alright, so thanks for watching this, and if you watch the whole thing, good for you. Hope you learned something, and thanks for watching. Subscribe and like for more.